Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I am your host Joey Ayub, and today we'll be talking to Rohini Hensman. She's an India-based Sri Lankan labor activist, feminist, and independent scholar whose book Indefensible Democracy, Counterrevolution, and the Rhetoric of Anti-Imperialism I've reviewed some years ago, and which will be the topic of our conversation today. In that book, she argues that the apparent anti-imperialism of many self-professed socialists amounts to explicit or implicit support for totalitarianism, fascism, Islamic theocracy, and, ironically enough, imperialism. She goes through the examples of Syria, Iran, Iraq, Bosnia, Russia, and Ukraine. Some of you may know by now that this has been a concern of mine for a few years now, and I wanted to take this opportunity to bring it to a wider audience, so I invited Rohini on to explore how such a supposedly noble political position, anti-imperialism, can be so easily corrupted. I should say here that you don't have to identify with any ism to find this topic informative. You just need to be someone who opposes authoritarian politics. So, that's today's episode. This episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Thank you for listening and take care.
I'm Rohini Hensman. I'm a writer, independent scholar, meaning I'm not attached to any institution, an activist, Marxist, feminist, internationalist. I come from Sri Lanka, but I live in India.
So your book, which we'll be talking about here, asks a question that I know many of the listeners would have asked themselves, if not specifically maybe like touching around the topic. Namely, like how has the rhetoric of what we might call anti-imperialism, very broadly understood, come to be used by various actors in support of anti-democratic counter-revolutions around the world?
Yeah. Well, the reason I came to ask this question specifically at that point in time was that the Syrian uprising was being basically crushed very brutally. And one would expect that there would be an outcry from the left. I mean, earlier on, when the Arab Spring started at the end of 2010, the entire left welcomed it. I mean, we all felt very excited, and this was a positive development. But very soon, I realized that the response to, say, the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia was different from the response to the uprisings in Syria and Libya. And then as the repression grew, it became more and more obvious that there was a significant section of the left which did not side with the uprising in Syria in particular, and which even was, cheering on for Assad. And that I found really upsetting to the extent that I felt, I mean, it's very difficult to do something from here in India, but that I had to do something. And then various, at that roughly that time, other things were also happening. There was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the incursion into the east of Ukraine, and then the annexation of Crimea. And again, you had a section of the left which was cheering it on. So that was something that really set me off. And I thought I have to understand and help other people to understand why this is happening, because it's really a very negative development for the left to be taking these stands. Yeah.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, I wrote a review of your book, Indefensible. It's available online. They can look it up, and I'll post it in the show notes. So, to kind of kickstart the conversation, thank you for this background. How would you understand, how do you understand the question of why? So why does this happen? What are some of the underlying causes, let's say?
Yeah. Well, actually, the way I traced it back um, was I feel that the core problem or the original problem is to do with, it starts with what happened to the Russian Revolution and then the counter-revolution that occurred in Russia, in spite of which a large section of socialists continue to treat Russia as a socialist country and the Stalinists as socialists. And this sort of carried on throughout the Cold War, where you had people on one side, the American side, supporting US imperialism, but on the other side, where you had, in some ways, equally horrific um, violations of human rights, imperialist domination of what was formerly Tsarist Russian colonies. While that was going on, people were treating it as calling it socialism and communism, which of course gives a completely wrong idea from the standpoint I would take of what is meant by socialism or communism. So I think this is one section of people who support what later, you know, became Putin's Russia, which actually had absolutely no resemblance to what Russia was after the revolution, and is
Yeah.
not even similar to Stalin's Russia
Yeah.
and all its allies. Yeah, so this is one section of people, the well, what I call neo-Stalinists, because they are no longer like the old Stalinists, who support everything that Russia and its allies do, regardless of how atrocious it is and how oppressive it is. But there's a much wider section of people who maybe don't necessarily um, support Assad or Putin, but who more generally feel that um, their their only the only thing they have to do is to oppose Western imperialism. And this seems to me also a very strange sort of stance to take, because if you're a true internationalist, you should support um, struggles against capitalism and against authoritarianism wherever they occur in the world. And maybe you have more leverage to support struggles against your own state. But regardless of that, you should also do your best, at least to speak out against oppression by other imperialisms or other authoritarian states, and possibly to take other actions such as demonstrating against them and so on. So this is another section I would feel. And if you ask them why they don't do this, there's a sort of hedging that goes on. And I mean, ultimately, these people also join in a sort of binary that if you don't support these supposedly anti-US, anti-Israel forces, then it necessarily means that you are supporting US imperialism and Israeli aggression and so on. And they don't seem to understand that there is, a possible third position where you oppose both. That's a very common sort of stance. And finally, of course, taking advantage of this, you have the despots, the tyrants, the authoritarian dictators and the imperialists on the other side, who sort of claim that because they are opposed to the US and its allies, they are therefore anti-imperialists. So you have the worst elements also claiming to be anti-imperialists. So I think this is the way in that why this has happened.
So there are three broad categories of this tendency, which you're calling, you called in the book pseudo anti-imperialism. I've called it alt-imperialism. I think Leila Shami called it the, anti-imperialism of idiots. So many other terms have been used. And it is a real problem on the left. And to many people, it might actually sound like we're focusing a bit too much on this relatively small minority or whatever. But I think that the tendency goes beyond, and I of course agree with the points you make in the book, that it goes beyond those that are necessarily like card-carrying supporters of this ideology. There's a broader tendency which people adhere to various extent and which can be just as damaging. So just to reiterate them, the three categories for those who missed it, you have the tyrants and imperialists on one side. You have the neo-Stalinists, what many people just call tankies these days, on like as a second category. And then you have those that, and here I'm quoting you, seem unable to deal with complexity, including the possibility that there may be more than one oppressor in a particular situation. So like, as you said, they can't understand that there can be actually two bad guys. And as part of my own commentary here, I'll just briefly also mention that I had an episode with the Arab Tyrant Manual last year, and in which I was asked very similar questions to the sort of conversation we're having right now by Ahmed Gatnash, who's a Libyan British activist and so on. And one of the things that I also reiterated many times is this allergy, this hostility towards complexity. And one of the main takeaways that I got from your book, and something which again I've myself concluded from my understanding of specifically of Syria in the past decade now, and sometimes I can't believe that it's already been a decade, is that this alt-imperialism, or whatever we want to call it, depends on, and here I'm quoting you again, a West centrism, which makes them oblivious to the fact that people in other parts of the world have agency too, and that they can exercise it both to oppress others and to fight against oppression. An Orientalism which refuses to acknowledge that third world peoples can desire and fight for democratic rights and freedoms taken for granted in the West, and a complete lack of solidarity with people who do undertake such struggles, end quote. Essentially, this is it's kind of a joke, I suppose, in the circles I would be in now, of anything that happens in the world, unless it's has to do with us in this imaginary case being like Americans or Westerners or whatever, then it's necessarily a conspiracy, or it's necessarily a Western plot, or the CIA has its hands in one way or another, et cetera, et cetera. I've seen this tendency, and I'll ask you to kind of comment from your own background on this. I've seen it not just with Westerners, which I think at this point I've spoken way too much about already, but I've been at the receiving end of it. I've been called whatever you wanna think of, from Al Qaeda to ISIS, agent of empire. Sometimes they just call me a liberal because they think this is the worst thing they can call me. From both Westerners in the West, as I said, but also, although in smaller proportions, smaller numbers, I should say, like other Arabs in the Middle East, and even nominally like anti-imperialist Arabs, or Arab leftists specifically, who reproduce this kind of what I'm calling alt-imperialism. You've made that argument. Myself, other people have also they're deeply invested in a West centrism, as I just quoted you from, and being unable to view the agency of Assad in Syria or Gaddafi in Libya at the time, or what have you, just like to name the two most common names that are often brought up, ignoring things like Assad's participation with the CIA torture program under the Bush administration, Gaddafi's very open, cozy relationship with Berlusconi, his assassination of activists abroad and in Libya, and so on. This to me is the same, or kind of like the other side of the coin, of those who believe in US exceptionalism through military means. And so they don't reproduce the same logic. They don't just reproduce the same logic, they reproduce the same narrative, and they just simply pick the other camp. So it's a campism, it's a binary. And they don't try to undo that binary, obviously. That's kind of the entire problem here. They don't seek that third option. So this would be my experience from the Arab world. I would maybe expand on it in a bit. But would you mind bringing in sense like your own background into this? Because I think it does offer a unique perspective.
Yeah, well, I came from basically an anti-imperialist family in Sri Lanka. Both my parents were committed anti-imperialists, and they tracked sort of liberation struggles around the world. So I grew up in that sort of atmosphere. But they were, I mean, that was part of a general support for democracy, for and against authoritarianism, wherever it came up, including in Sri Lanka itself. And so I associated anti-imperialism with anti-authoritarianism, and pro-democracy, which is why one reason why I was so appalled, at what was happening after the, over the Syrian revolution. And actually that was one thing. The other thing is, as a feminist too, I find support for these regimes quite obnoxious. I mean, all of them are extremely patriarchal and was misogynist. I mean, horrific treatment of women, including women political prisoners, torture, rape used as a weapon of war. I mean, in fact, when this Syria thing happened, it recalled to me a previous episode, which was I found equally horrendous, which was the Bosnian genocide. And there too, you had a section of the left, including some pretty, mainstream people like Edward Hensman, who was Chomsky's associate and co-author and so on, coming out very strongly in support of the Serb nationalists. And when you think of the horrific things, I mean, actual genocide that was happening, but that included mass rape, rape camps, something which hadn't actually been recorded before as a way in which to commit genocide, and which has not even been addressed yet today. You have victims, former victims, who are still waiting for some kind of acknowledgement of their experience. So as a feminist also, I find this is really hard to take the kind of support for these regimes. So both as a sort of anti-imperialist from my early years and as a feminist, I find it quite repellent, really, these tendencies. Then, as you mentioned, I think there's also, I call it Orientalism, and as you mentioned, but I would even go so far as to call it racism. I mean, imagine you have these huge masses of people coming out in peaceful protest, and you say that they are being manipulated either by Islamists or by imperialists. You don't give them the benefit of recognizing them, as people who want democracy, just like you. But no, they're different. So somehow, and you're right, we find it even amongst our people, that is third world people. You said among Arabs, I found it in India too, that this kind of writing off, of these huge uprisings as either Islamist or imperialist or both. Yeah.
Yeah, on the matter of India, would you mind expanding a bit expanding a bit on that example?
Well, I mean, from the standpoint of India, one thing is that earlier on, at least, it was a staunch supporter of Palestine, and many on the left, people on the left, still support Palestine. And part of the problem, I think, is that they have swallowed this discourse about the axis of resistance, and therefore they feel that those who claim to be part of the axis of resistance, such as Assad or Khamenei or these people, have to be supported. So one section of the left, I think that is their motivation for supporting these people. They feel that in order to support, I mean, again, which is crazy because Assad has actually bombed Palestinians in Syria. There are Palestinian political prisoners. And apart from that, the fact that he's doing it to Syrians surely should make one think, is he really pro-Palestinian? Uh, if he crushes a democratic uprising in this way, is he supporting democracy in Palestine? No, I don't think so. So that is one motivation. I mean, the other thing is there's, I don't know, for whatever reason, a failure to identify and empathize. See, I mean, in India, you have a situation where um, ethno-religious minorities, women, workers, the rural poor, then dissidents of all kinds, including journalists, intellectuals, academics, human rights defenders, all are being suppressed in various ways. So you have a similar situation in Syria, and one would expect that people who are facing this kind of situation in our country would sympathize and identify with people who are being subjected to the same kinds of oppression elsewhere. But again, this kind of racism comes in the way, I think, that you see them, they seem to be opposed to US imperialism. They claim to be against Israeli oppression, the state. Therefore, you must support them, support the oppressors in this situation and not the people rising up against them, which is very weird, really. I mean, I see these people. I mean, that's why one feels so terrible about what's happening in Syria, because there are people like us, who are being crushed, and that's what I would expect anyone on the left to feel.
Yeah, I had a very similar I think thought process in the past decade. So my exposure to Syria was through Lebanon because I grew up in Lebanon and I'm Lebanese, and there's a very specific context there. To some people, Syria is the ally that helped Lebanon resist against Israel. To other people, Syria was the invader in 1976. And the reality is it's a combo of both, but it's also beyond both because the support against Israel, for example, in southern Lebanon was conditional. It had its limitations. At times it was contradictory, and it erases the fact. So this would have been in the 80s. It erases the fact that in 76, or the people who bring this up erase the fact that in 1976, the Hafez al-Assad's regime invaded Lebanon to oppose the Palestinian and left-wing nationalist factions. And the year after the invasion in 1977, the assassination of Kamal Jumblat was one of the initial, who was the leader, I should say, of that coalition, which is broadly called, I forgot the English name, but like Palestinian factions, left-wing factions, and a few nationalist factions in Lebanon. Broadly speaking, the main opponent was the Christian right-wing nationalists at the time, who were broadly aligned with Israel, although on and off, it's a bit more complicated. The people who bring these up, bring the 80s without bringing up the 70s, or who mention Hezbollah's role against Israel in the 90s, but then ignore events like in 2008 when Hezbollah essentially took over parts of Beirut and Mount Lebanon, or obviously ignore Hezbollah's military intervention in Syria since 2011, especially since 2012, 2013. It suggests to me that they're willing to actually go against their own history. So the example I usually give is the example of Lebanese and Syrian communists. There are many of them, and there's no one tendency. But those who were opposed to the authoritarian regimes in Lebanon or in Syria were those who were crushed, exiled, or killed. And those who kind of put that aside or even openly allied themselves with these regimes were more or less allowed to operate because essentially they were defanged. They don't really pose a threat. In Lebanon, this took direct consequence. I mean, in Syria as well, although that's a different story. In Lebanon, prominent Marxist and communist intellectuals in the south, like Mahdi Amel, were assassinated by what would end up becoming Hezbollah. And these were people who were part of the community. These were people who were Shias from southern Lebanon, where before the advent of what would end up becoming Wilayat al-Faqih, Iran's foreign policy, essentially, after 79, obviously, they were the ones who were dominating large parts of politics, especially rural and working class politics in parts of Lebanon, in this case, southern Lebanon especially. And there were a lot of these, I suppose Gramsci would call them like organic intellectuals, essentially, coming up. Now, it's a broader story, and I will say that I've had an episode with Ziad Majid, who was sort of part of that world for a long time. And on the 15th commemoration of the assassination of Samir Qasir, who, so that would have been the 2nd of June, 2005, who was someone who was a left-wing Lebanese, Palestinian, Syrian, involved in liberation struggles in both Palestine and Syria, and who saw both of them linked, as well as linked to the struggle in Lebanon at the time against the Syrian government, because that would have been after the liberation of southern Lebanon in 2000. So between 2000 and 2005 is when all of this happened, obviously. And so if I'm saying all of this to say that there are still people today in Lebanon, not many, although because in general, these numbers are not very high in the first place, who would call themselves communists, but who sort of glance over the fact that Hezbollah did this to communists. Kind of similar things with some Iranian anti-imperialists glossing over the role of Khomeini in crushing Iranian communists. These people would often fight with other Iranian communists or people who call themselves Iranian communists, who obviously oppose Khomeini for those specific reasons, or Khamenei these days for those specific reasons. And so all of this to say that it goes back to your initial point, that this being uncomfortable with complexity, being willing to sort of go with the flow, to embrace one narrative that's easy to digest. And it does incredible damage, a lot of damage. I'm barely scratching the surface here. I mentioned assassinations and I've barely started scratching the surface here. You already, I wanted to ask you again about the Sri Lankan context, because I feel that probably most people listening to this don't know as much as they should know. But would you mind just mentioning how anti-imperialism as a rhetoric, as a narrative, was used and maybe is still being used by the ruling establishment in Sri Lanka to sort of, essentially whitewash their own politics?
Well, I think most people know there was a civil war in Sri Lanka. It started off, basically, there was oppression of the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. And eventually an armed group, there were many armed groups, but the Liberation Tigers of Tamil became the dominant one, which was what was part, they were on the other side of the war. Huge violations of human rights occurred on both sides. And in the end, it ended in May 2009 in a most horrific way. The Tamil Tigers basically using Tamil civilians, hundreds of thousands of them, forced them to retreat as the Sri Lankan forces were advancing. At that time, Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president. His brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa was the army commander, and they showed no mercy. They knew that most of these people were civilians. They knew that the Tigers were forcing them to retreat. And still they went ahead, they bombed hospitals, they bombed bread lines. And at the end of the war, at least 40,000, and some people put it as many more civilians were killed when the Sri Lankan forces finally defeated the Tigers. So this is at the same time, actually, and soon after, you also had the government. Of course, not all Sinhalese were in favor of what was happening. And you found the government clamping down on people who objected. So there was that going on as well. So it wasn't as though it was internally democratic. So at the end of the war, you had there was mainly, I think, Western powers in the UN, in the Human Rights Council, as well as the Security Council, arguing that there should be an investigation into war crimes at the end of the war in Sri Lanka, and people should be held accountable. Now, in that context, you had Mahinda Rajapaksa claiming anti-imperialism in opposing this demand for accountability for war crimes. And that was the grounds on which he opposed it. Now, you would think that anyone who knew the kind of oppression that had been heaped on Tamils, I mean, apart from those who were killed, hundreds of thousands were currently kept in military camps, interned in military camps. It was pretty horrendous. People didn't know. Their relatives outside didn't know who had died, who had survived, who had disappeared. Nothing. And at this point, you would expect anyone to support a demand for, at least for investigation, and to some degree for accountability, which would also have helped the Tigers to account for their atrocities too. But no, I mean, you found, and what I found especially, I mean, I would expect China and Russia to object, but what I found especially disturbing was these, these pink-tied people in Latin America. They were supporting Rajapaksa, and you even had the Evo Morales regime giving Mahinda Rajapaksa, I think it was a Peace and Democracy Award. At that point, I must say, I lost my respect for them, because they could not have not known, and if they didn't know, they should have known what had been going on. And to honor someone who has been slaughtering civilians, I think is really beyond the pale. So that was my experience, which I, again, personal experience of the way in which anti-imperialism has been used by criminals, basically, people responsible for mass crimes, to cover up their crimes, and the way in which other people have accepted it, unfortunately.
Yeah. I was thinking while you're mentioning the list of crimes earlier, the gendered aspect of it, which you already brought up, and obviously as a feminist is something that you would also focus on. I feel that by and large, this tendency that again we're calling like tankies, alt-imperialists, pseudo-anti-imperialists, all of that, authoritarianism on quote unquote the left, or broadly speaking so, um, especially online, but I don't think it's just an online matter. It doesn't take too much to notice. It doesn't take too much to notice that they tend to be men. On the internet, they tend to be white men. Um, or at least in this sort of thing that I end up having to focus on due to the role of the West versus Russia versus whatever. Um, do you think that there is a link, or rather, like I know you will say yes, so I'll ask it in this way: like, what is the link between masculinity, misogyny, patriarchy, these forms of power and domination, or at least the forms of masculinity that are authoritarian and toxic? What is the relationship between these things and this specific form of quote unquote anti-imperialism, which we've been calling different names here? What are some of these links and how would you understand it? And I'll just preface this briefly by saying, um, I'm asking this because I don't think enough attention has been paid to the gendered component of it, and this is very common still, even in humanitarian discourse, even in international law, even in like accountability studies, which is something that I focused on in case of Lebanon because I'll include this now as a parenthesis. Um, Lebanon also had a civil war, of course, 75 to 1990, as I mentioned before. And the crimes that were committed during that war, which included rape and torture and everything, were essentially written off in 1990, 1991 through this amnesty law. And long story short, it's how the warlords that were in power during the war ended up, most of them anyway, ended up in government after the war. And they're all men, obviously, and it's Lebanon remains, although there is a very vibrant feminist movement, remains a hyper patriarchal society. And I do think that by and large, this form of anti-imperialism, which again I'm putting in quotation, the other words that we called it would be more appropriate, does in part or in large parts draw its political energy, let's say, from existing patriarchal structures and from existing misogyny, and then we can add transphobia and homophobia and all of these things that also come with it. It can be very obvious as soon as you put on feminist glasses, let's say, as soon as you put on this form of analysis, as soon as you include it in as a framework, then the links are very obvious. But because these glasses are not put on in the first place, it can be very jarring to see people, often men, but not always. Sometimes there are women who also participate in this, but they tend to be men. Might even call themselves feminists and whatnot because they're left wing and whatever, but sort of reproduce this form of authoritarian logic, which ultimately is linked in one way or another to patriarchal domination and violence. So, how would you see this link between masculinity and quote unquote alt-imperialism or whatever we want to call it?
Well, I mean, I have argued elsewhere, not in this book, that one of the pillars, a key pillar of any authoritarian state is the authoritarian patriarchal family. And I think all of these authoritarian regimes, whether they are on the right, and proto-fascist, or claim to be on the left, but are in many ways equally oppressive. They depend to a large degree on suppressing women. And I feel that, sort of the patriarchal family itself, the last resort, to enforce the subordination of women is violence. And there is a huge amount of violence against women, which may or may not be acknowledged. And women fighting against it um, are often suppressed and repressed. So I don't see, I would see this as being a key feature of all these regimes because they are authoritarian. I think they do rely on patriarchy, misogyny, and yeah, in many cases, homophobia. The so-called family values, which see women as necessarily being subordinate, girls being less valuable than boys, etc. And violence against women as being permissible. So it's not there's no puzzle here really. I mean, I would agree with you that this kind of masculinity is uh, very compatible with and is necessarily part of, even where there are women, a few women who participate in this. Yeah, they also have succumbed to this logic, yeah, of aggressive masculinity.
Yeah.
Um,
I would just add a quick other example that I forgot to bring up on the figure of Hezbollah's leader himself, like Hassan Nasrallah. Um, if people just listen to his speeches, and a lot of them are subtitled in English for those who don't know, and because like it actually benefit like his supporters actively happily add subtitles in English and whatnot because they see this as part of their mission. Um, his comments on feminism, on just people who are LGBTQ, which he doesn't even recognize as existing, um, are so right wing that they would make a number of right wing figures in places like Europe and America look liberal in comparison. They are extremely ultra conservative. He literally views feminism as a Western invention, as a Western import, which obviously comes directly through the line from Khomeini and Khamenei. Very obvious for people who study these two figures and others around them. Um, and it can be, again, very it's kind of this, for me personally, it ends up becoming a sort of like a dissociative state of, I see on one side people saying one thing, and then as soon as they cross the border, so to speak, to Lebanon or to Syria or to whatever, Iran or whatever, then they put on a completely different hat, which is identical to what someone on the far right would say. And indeed, Syria for me was the case study, if you want, par excellence of this happening. I would at some point, and I documented them in a document. That's how meticulous and obsessive I was about it. The Western politicians who would go to Syria, to Damascus specifically, invited by the Assad regime, if you see from which kind of side of the political spectrum they're on, it's roughly 70 to 80% far right, and then the remaining 20 to 30% quote unquote left wing anti imperialists. And these include American politicians, Spanish politicians, some in the UK, and et cetera, et cetera. And I can also name, leaders in both the left and the far right in France having almost identical quotes when it comes to Bashar Assad. And so this brings me in some ways to, although it's a bit of an awkward segment, in a segue, sorry. In the last section of your book, you list 5 ways that anti-authoritarians can use to counter that tendency that we've been talking about here. Can you go through them a bit?
yes, I mean, yeah, the first one I say is to pursue the truth and tell the truth. And here, actually, I mean, I think a lot of the people who swallow the kind of disinformation that's being dished out, I don't blame all of them because it's really hard. It's really hard to, it takes a lot of time and effort to find out for yourself what is actually going on. But the people who, who create this, who create this disinformation, who put it out, who, create bots, who repeat it ad nauseam and so on. I mean, that is, I think that is a counter-revolutionary thing to do. And it's whether regardless of what you call yourself, that is right wing, because it completely denies, and well, you see what's happening in the US right now. It completely denies the truth and therefore helps actively, I think it helps people who are oppressors to carry on oppressing. And therefore, I think it is the task and the responsibility of those of us who are opposed to this kind of oppression to find out the truth and to find ways of getting it out and telling people that it's not a simple matter of everything that's put out in the Western media is wrong. Everything that's put out in the anti-Western media is correct. No, you have to use your mind and look at them all critically. And you will find, inconsistency in stuff that is on both sides. But in many ways, there's so much similarity. For example, in the stories about weapons of mass destruction put out before and to justify the war on Iraq on the one hand, and now the stories denying, say, the chemical weapons attacks on Syrians. It's so similar. And in both cases, I think it helps an aggressor to kill and maim and displace innocent people. So it is, I think, a profoundly counter-revolutionary and criminal thing to do. You become then part of the crime. The second one I said was to bring back humanity and humanity and morality into politics. I mean, this may sound wishy-washy, but I think it's absolutely necessary. And as Howard Zinn said, in a world of conflict where there are victims and executioners, it's the responsibility of thinking people not to be on the side of the executioners. And unfortunately, this is what the people whom I call pseudo anti-imperialists are. They are taking the side of the executioners and completely either ignoring or in some cases actually vilifying the victims. Like you get these horrific, all these stories against the white helmets who are actually rescue workers. And they have saved thousands of lives. And many of them have been killed in the process. And you vilify them as Islamists, as imperialists, etc. And you vilify the victims whom they are trying to help, the children who are being bombed. You call them also terrorists. I mean, that is something totally evil. And I think a lot of people, not just socialists, but anyone with any kind of humanitarian instincts should not participate in that and should see what is wrong with that. And the third one was democracy. And here I think we have a problem on the left which I think is in some ways encapsulated by the term bourgeois democracy. Somehow democracy is associated with capitalism and therefore it is dismissed. as being not what we fight for. But this is completely, I mean, when I look, I have actually examined, gone back to Marx and Engels and so on. And this is not at all how democracy was seen. In fact, democratic revolution was seen as in some ways the first step towards a socialist revolution. So this is a profoundly wrong attitude to democracy, and therefore we should support struggles for democracy wherever they are in the world, because that is one step towards socialism. And I think we have to critique not just the Stalinist, I mean, those are the worst in some ways because they justified an ultra authoritarian dictatorship, which crushed democracy completely. But I think there are also others on the left who may even be anti-Stalinist, but who still have this suspicion against democracy, and certainly don't see it as their duty to support democratic struggles. So that is one thing. Or they see the revolution as coming from above in some ways, by a party or some section of elite, and not by the people, working people as a mass. Then actually this leads on to the whole thing of internationalism, which I see as a third necessary. I think that's the third one. Yeah, because capitalism is an international system, and the world is increasingly globalized, and whatever problems we face, whether it's from poverty and unemployment to global warming to refugees to none of these can be that whole idea that you can tackle any of these things, including poverty, say, and unemployment, simply within the borders of one country, of your own country, is wrong. And therefore, what is happening in the rest of the world is of profound importance to your own struggle. That if elsewhere there is some dictatorship which is crushing democracy, and crushing democracy means crushing, for example, trade unions, which means crushing workers' struggles, women's rights struggles. That will ultimately, it's going to affect you, because that in order to oppose capitalism, you need the help of those people who are being crushed. So it is absolutely necessary and not a luxury that you support struggles for democracy, for human rights, wherever they happen in the world, because that is part of the struggle for socialism. What were the other things I said? I think institutions of, it has become extremely evident, I think, especially from the example of Syria, that any international attempt to help a population of working people under a more or less genocidal assault will need to deal with the fact that any such help can be blocked by the Security Council. And this is not the only thing I'm talking about, but that is one of the things, by the Security Council, permanent members, which who will not allow any such assistance, even to supply food and medicine. Forget about any kind of military assistance. Even food and medicine could not be delivered to populations under siege who are being starved. So I think there are institutions that can be made use of. I mean, like the International Criminal Court, I think. Though again, there's a problem that as of now, you have to go through the Security Council unless the country is signed up and ratified the Rome Statute. But I think we can't completely, although we try to, as much as possible, to build solidarity from below, there are some things ordinary people like us can't do. We can, as I said before, we can pursue the truth, we can publicize the truth, we can maybe hold meetings and demonstrations in support of people who are being assaulted. But most of us are not really equipped to be able to supply them with, what they need in terms of support um, to defend their lives, And I think to oppose any attempts to help them, I think also you become complicit in what is happening to them. I mean, I'm thinking, and I may be wrong here, but I'm thinking of the demand for safe zones, zones in Syria, which I think many Syrians were asking for. Now, how it would work, I don't know. But at least we have to look at that. People who are being bombarded, who are being gassed, who are being besieged and starved and killed. We have to do something, I think, which we cannot do as civilians. Something needs to be done for them. And for that, we need some institution to call upon to do that. And I think to oppose that kind of initiative outright is wrong, because then you become complicit, in the slaughter.
One of the underlying themes of I think this year's episodes, one of the things I'm going to try and focus on is the commemoration of the fact that it's been 10 years since the start of the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. It's a very personal story as well, and I will be spending some episodes going into them a bit more, going into that aspect of it a bit more. But one of the negative things that has happened since then is the rise of authoritarianism throughout the world. And, I don't want to be Arab centric either. It's not just about the Arab Spring. It's not just about the Middle East and North Africa, of course. There are other factors. But I do see that part of the problem that we're facing in the world, broadly speaking, today, is the fact that there have been no consequences for people that have committed open crimes against humanity. And this doesn't just include people in the Arab, this doesn't just include Arab dictators. It doesn't just include Putin, whatnot. I'm also referring to Western leaders in various capacities as well. But I do think there's something specific about what happened in Syria and what's been happening in Syria and the consequences on the world. Various people, Syrians have, I think Yassin Harsadeh called it like the Syrianization of the world, and that sort of thing, by which they mean the normalization of impunity. The fact that it's become, especially in the past 4 to 5 years, and indeed we're recording this just a couple of days after the storming of the Capitol in the US, we've seen where this extremely toxic combination of things like online disinformation, we can even include the really messed up algorithms that social media giants use, and obviously toxic masculinity, like the sort of thing that we see in Trump, who was also addicted to Twitter, and that, he was banned a few hours ago. All of these things, in addition to the sort of environmental pressures that are increasing, and in addition to the economic crisis, which inevitably or most likely will continue for the foreseeable future, especially as we're still dealing and healing from the consequences of the global COVID-19 pandemic. I do think part of all of that, like in order to understand all of it, part of the story is looking at how the world has reacted or has not reacted, we should say, or has reacted in a specific way to the Syrian crisis. And this is perhaps most obviously, or most obvious, I think, in both the Arab world and in Europe, which is the closest Western power, obviously, to the Arab world. And I'm thinking, of course, of Fortress Europe, the raising up of the walls. While they're criticizing Trump's plan, they're kind of doing the same stuff to their own borders. Some of the militarization tactics that the European use are actually worse than what the Americans use. And I will briefly say that I will have an upcoming guest from the Border Violence Monitoring Network in the EU, which I've had them on before as well, but they've recently published something called I'm going to try and remember the title, The Black Book of Pushbacks. And it's this massive volume, like 1,200 pages or something, of these pushbacks. Pushbacks are literally when border police push refugees and asylum seekers and migrants back into a non-EU country where they no longer have to deal with them or think about them. There's, as I said, 1,200-page long document now on this, and it's being distributed in the EU by some parliamentarians and so on. And one of the things which I think reveals is sort of in addition to the already existing xenophobia and racism and nativism and nationalism and all of these things that we see in pretty much everywhere in the world, there's a very specific hatred and fear, both together at the same time, against and towards Syrian refugees. And even non-Syrian refugees are sort of lumped in at the same time as Syrian refugees. And this is the consequence of the Arab Spring, I would say, on Europe. And, putting aside the obvious ones like ISIS attacks and all of these things, which also were one big thing. But in the Arab world, so this is like Europe on one side, in the Arab world, the main result, with the exception of Tunisia, which had its own trajectory, is basically in Lebanon, for example, and in Egypt, and to a certain extent in Iraq. Those are the case studies that I know best. They use Syria to basically discourage, and I'm putting this in quotation, people from demanding a bit too much. So they can tolerate various forms of dissent, but this changes from place to place. In Iraq, it depends which region. In Egypt, it tends to be zero tolerance. And in the Gulf regions, obviously, even as much as in Egypt, if not worse so. In Lebanon, it also depends on the region. It depends on your class, what kind of clout you have. If you have sort of different forms of I would say, financial or cultural capital that might protect you from certain repercussions, what have you. But they've been using Syria essentially as like, well, at least we're not Syria. At least it's not as bad here as it is in Syria. Now, they no longer say this as much because things have gotten so bad in Lebanon since the explosion and the crisis and everything that it's not as obvious to just say that, and people don't seem to respond to it in the same way. But my point is that it worked for the better part of a decade to use that line of thought, that argument, that fear tactic, essentially. And I think this is another thing that authoritarian regimes and authoritarian regimes and even quote unquote Western democracies with their, they can be, some of them are authoritarian, some less so, it varies a lot. This is something that they have in common. And I feel like those who don't look, to go back to our topic more directly, who don't consider these tanky tendencies, including the actual tankies, of course, but even non-tankies. There are more non-tankies that participate in this tendency than there are actual tankies. And that's the problem. If it was just the tankies, then I wouldn't be bothering as much. The problem is that the tendency is very, very common. I think this is something that they don't seem to be able to link up as much. They don't seem to see the link, the sort of the fellow travelers in the train of thought, and it takes them to very dark conclusions, and yet they still frame it in broadly progressive terms. So my question to you after all of this is, how would you describe to your own politics, or on your own politics, the impact of the 2011 uprisings and revolutions, if that's okay?
Well, I mean, of course, I've learned a lot about them and about the countries involved, including Iraq, which I thought I knew something about earlier because of, opposition to the Iraq war. But it's actually a much more complex situation after the war. And I think, I feel you're right about the completely negative results around the world of the way in which the Arab uprisings somehow have been, there has not been any accountability for the repression of them. The fact that there was so much positive feeling when they started. And then, that's one of the things I learned, that the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq, the US-UK, the way in which it was then, they sectarianized it, and they handed over to, which is very bizarre, but they handed it over to Iran-backed Shia politicians and militias, which in turn worsened the sectarian conflict within Iraq, and then allowed ISIS, or at least the Islamic State of Iraq at first, to form. All these aspects which I was not aware of earlier, nor was I aware of the fact that from the beginning, Khomeini had his sights fixed on basically on dominating Iraq, which also I didn't know. I always thought of Saddam Hussein as the only bad guy in the Iran-Iraq war, and didn't realize that after 2 years it would have ended, if not for it being pushed further by Khomeini for another 6 years, in which over 1 million people died. So, and then, of course, now the problems of the fact that it has become much more much more fundamentalist dominated, the problems of women as a result of this, etc. Those kinds of problems I did not know of. So, what I have learned is, one thing is the incredibly complex character of what is going on in the countries which I looked at, again, including Iran, and the incredible courage, I would say, of the people standing up to the state there, given the horrific repression that they are meted out with. And even in Iraq now, the uprising was again crushed in very brutal ways. So one has to really admire the people who are fighting against sectarianism, against authoritarianism in these countries, and look for better ways of supporting them. And this is where I feel as you said, the reaction of these pseudo anti-imperialists is so toxic, because on the one hand, you would expect the right wing to support these authoritarian regimes, and they do. But you would expect a united left wing response against them, and it is not there. The so-called left is completely divided and confused. On one side, you do have people to support the uprisings and the democratic aspirations of the peoples of these countries. On the other hand, you have a section who supports the dictators, who supports the oppressors, who call themselves socialists. So from my point of view, this is partly an attempt to rescue socialism, and communism from this taint of being a supporter of autocracies. And I think the way in which the Arab Spring has progressed is something that brought this home to me in a very stark, and in some ways heartbreaking way. I mean, it still breaks my heart to think of what's happening in Syria and what has happened there. It's horrendous. Yeah. So yes,
Yeah.
it definitely had an impact on my thinking, no doubt about it.
Well, to sort of wrap the conversation up, what I'm now trying to do with guests is I basically ask them in advance to recommend 3 books, and it's a trick I've stolen from other podcasts because I've always had very awkward conclusions to the conversations. I don't know how to actually end them because we can go on and on and on. So I've asked you to recommend 3 books to our listeners. Would you mind doing that?
Yes. Now I know there are a large number of fantastic books about Syria, but the first one I read, which really alerted me to the complexity of the situation, to debates which took place say over whether to continue with peaceful protests or to go in for armed resistance, etc. Then the complexities of the Kurdish question, and so on. That is Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War by Robin Yassin Kassab and Leila Shami, which was the first one I read, which really was an eye-opener for me. And I learned a lot from that. And of course, I've read others since then. So I would definitely recommend that book to anyone who's studying Syria. Then, and a rather less commonly read book is called The Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia by Michael A. Sells, which gives the background to the Bosnian genocide. And actually, it shows that it wasn't just Srebrenica. The genocide was throughout Bosnia. And it took the most horrendous forms. And the underlying hatred of Muslims, the anti-Muslim bigotry is unbelievable. And we recognize it because, unfortunately, in both of my countries, India especially, there is a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry. But the form that it took in Bosnia is really stark and horrific. And the last book I would recommend is The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, by Ephraim Kirsch. And that's a rather unusual, not a very widely read one, I don't think, but to me, it opened up the whole dynamics of the Iran-Iraq relationship. What led to the war, and what followed from the war, which was pretty disastrous for Iraq and in many ways has shaped Iran as well, which is a precursor of the way in which Iran has now gone into Syria. Of course, it was there in Lebanon for a long time, and then wider reach into the region. As what I would see as a regional imperialist power as well. So that's the third book. Those are my 3 books.
Thank you very much. And I'll say that I will have Leila Shami on as well in a few weeks, actually, to talk about the 10-year commemoration of Syria and so on. So obviously we'll be mentioning that book. All right. Well, Rohini Hensman, thank you a lot for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope listeners agree with me, which I think they will.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.